Hello and welcome to Get Up and Game. My name is Josh. The first X-Men cycle in Marvel Champions has finally reached its conclusion with the recent releases of Rogue and Gambit. So now we have a really clear picture of what the card pool for the X-Men look like. And I don't think anybody could deny that they have received some incredible support over 8 different heroes in one wave. It's already possible to build incredible X-Men decks with lots of cards featuring just their effects and traits. But is it too much? Were the X-Men so heavily supported in this first wave that the rest of the card pool was just completely ignored? Or was there enough room left over for older decks to still get some really cool cards to find some new ways to play? Well, that's what we're going to find out in this video. A big thanks to community member Andy Norton for the idea for this video, as we're going to be taking a look at what the X-Men did for the card pool as a whole. Also, right now, Get Up and Game is on the road to 2,000 subscribers. As of this recording, we only need about 70. So if you enjoy Marvel Champions content and you haven't subscribed to the channel, I invite you to please do so. All right, let's just dive right in. Now, it's only natural for a game like this that's based around comic book characters and teams that over time the card pool might start to become more specifically geared towards certain teams and new characters. But I was curious as to what degree that has happened over time, so real quickly, let's take a look at what the card pool has looked like in each wave leading up to the X-Men. So in the core set, there were 44 uniquely named cards that you could use to build your decks, which, as we all know, didn't leave a lot of variety. And then with the 6 heroes of Wave 1, we got 70 new deck building options, and only 7 of them were trait locked. 6 of them you had to be an Avenger to play or would really only want to be played by Avengers. And then Doctor Strange had the Sorcerer Supreme, so there was 1 card that could only be used by Mystics. That still left 63 new cards for pretty much anybody to use in their decks. And of course, early on, everybody was an Avenger, so even those trait locks didn't really matter too much. And then with the rise of Red Skull and the preceding 4 heroes, there were 66 new deck building options, so just slightly fewer than Wave 1. But this time, 13 of them were trait locked, 10 to the Avengers. We got another Mystic card with Scarlet Witch, and there were also 2 team-up cards that were incredibly limited, so not really trait locked, but also not available for general use. So this time there were only 53 new cards available to pretty much anybody to use, 10 less than the first wave. Wave 3 only brought 57 new deck building options as we started to see more and more reprints pop up. In the first 2 waves, pretty much only core set cards were getting reprinted, but by the time the Guardians rolled around, even cards from previous hero packs had started to get reprinted, so there were fewer uniquely new cards. And this time, 14 of them were limited, 13 were playable only by Guardians, and then there was the 1 team-up card with Rocket and Groot, leaving only 43 for the general card pool. Again, 10 less than the previous wave. So we can see even by Wave 3, the card pool is becoming more and more specifically geared to certain teams, and cards that could be used in just any deck were slowly getting a smaller and smaller pool. Now, Wave 4 does bump those numbers back up, but it's for one very specific reason. There were 69 new deck building options, which is more than the previous 2 waves, only 1 less than the first wave, where pretty much every card could be used by anybody. But the main reason for that is Adam Warlock had so many one-ofs that were brand new that really sort of artificially inflated that number. And 21 of them were limited to certain teams or traits. 2 for the Avengers, 5 for the Guardians, 4 for the Mystics, again thanks to Adam Warlock. There were 5 Alliance cards that were limited to Asgard and Guardians being played together, so those are pretty limited. 2 Asgard traded cards with Valkyrie, 1 Android with Vision, and 2 more team-up cards. But that still left 48 cards for general use. Though again, a bunch of those were the ones that came into Adam Warlock and aren't necessarily all that great. And the one I was really curious to see what the numbers were, because in Wave 5, they started building up 2 new teams, the Web Warriors and the Champions. And that was also the first wave where they started using modular encounter sets in the back of the packs instead of more deck building cards. So I was curious to see what the numbers look like, to see if those were even more limited. And they definitely were. There were 64 new options for deck building, so that number didn't go down really at all. But 30 of them were trait locked or limited, 18 for Web Warriors, 9 for the Champions. We got the 2 cards for the 14 hit point heroes. We got 1 card specifically traded to Genius, and technically Moon Girl did too, but I included her with Champion. But Ingenuity was limited to just a few heroes that have the Genius trait. And then we got 1 team-up card with Miles and Gwen, leaving only 34 cards for the general card pool. So if you weren't interested in building Web Warrior or Champion decks, there weren't a ton of new cards. And one pack that was particularly telling, Spider-Ham only had 7 cards that weren't reprints of cards we'd already had before, and 5 of them were locked to the Web Warrior. So if you're buying everything, Spider-Ham didn't really give you much new at all. So all told, leading up to the X-Men, we had 370 uniquely named deck building options, and there were still 241 available for the general card pool. You didn't necessarily have to be a certain character or a certain team to play those cards. Now it's important to know I didn't count Ariel against these numbers, even though that is decently limited. So if you want to, you could take away about 6 cards from that. And then I also didn't really count the traits like you need to have a spy or a weapon, or if it were the shield traded cards from Miles, because those are still decently generally useful for most heroes. It was really more the ones that you had to be on a certain team to play. So now that we have a frame of reference for what the card pool has looked like leading up to the X-Men, let's go through all the cards that came with them and see how many really were just for them, how many were reprints, because there were quite a few, and how many you can go back and use in older heroes. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it clear, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good or a bad thing. I just think it's interesting because so many different types of people buy this game and they buy it for different reasons. You might buy everything just because you want to, and if you're not a big X-Men fan, there might not have been a lot here for you, or maybe there was. That's what we're going to find out. But on the flip side, if you are a big X-Men fan and you were only buying this, I think you were well cared for and you got everything you needed. Now, me personally, I'm definitely someone who always wants to be able to build good decks for every hero, so I always want as many new cards as possible. And I haven't really felt that limited. I think there are some really cool cards here that a lot of different heroes can use, but we'll save all that talk for the end. Let's actually dig in and see what the numbers say. So let's just go through them in order. We'll take a look at the cards that came with Colossus, and the first one we have is Nightcrawler. Now, you don't technically have to be an X-Man to play Nightcrawler, but I don't think you're going to be using him if you're not, because his ability only helps X-Men. So we'll start, the left pile here will be for cards that are trait locked or only going to be used for X-Men characters. And next was Polaris, and I think she's really good for general use because she can still give herself the tough status card. So I think this is just a good protection ally in general that could be used in any decks. So the middle column will be for cards that can be used by anybody. And then next we have Bait and Switch, which is a reprint of an older card. So part of this exercise is if you've bought all the cards leading up to this, some of these cards just aren't going to be useful to you because you just don't really need new ones. Now, I know some people keep all of their decks built all the time, so they might use all of the card pool, but just for the sake of this, we're saying if you already have a card, you don't need it again. And so we'll put the reprints over here on the end. And Bait and Switch isn't really one of my favorite cards anyway, so I definitely didn't feel like I needed any more of those. Next, we get Protective Training, and this can only go on X-Men allies, so you're probably only going to be using it in X-Men decks. Powerful Punch is a fantastic new protection card that works for anybody, so we're definitely putting that in the middle column. Perseverance, another reprint. Now, this is a pretty good card, so it was nice to have this. And I understand that the way the hero packs work, they want the decks to be fully functional, so they might include older cards again that work particularly well with the character. So I get why we get reprints, but at the same time, I'm always sad to see a card I already have, even if it's a pretty good one, because I always build brand new decks every time I play, so I don't need extra copies of anything personally. Mutant Protectors, you have to be an X-Man to play this, so definitely going in the left column. Defensive Energy is a really interesting new resource card that can be used by anybody, so happy to have that in the card pool. Speaking of happy to have in the card pool, Professor X thankfully is not trait locked to the X-Men and is become a very ubiquitous ally in a lot of decks, pretty much put in every single one of mine. So he goes in the middle. X-Jet can only be used for X-Men, so definitely putting it on the left. Very, very good card though. I'm glad to have it for the X-Men. Shadow and Steel is the team up for Colossus and Shadowcat, so that is going to go, it's not trait locked to the X-Men, but it is limited, not usable by very many other characters, so put that there on the left. And then, of course, we get the resource cards in everybody. And since I counted these in the original numbers, we will count them against the X-Men, and I don't mean it to sound negative, like, oh, this is bad that this is happening, but they are in the pack, and they do take up space that could have technically been other cards, so those will go in the reprint column. So we see here a pretty even mix. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different cards that came with Colossus can only be used by X-Men. We got 4 new cards that went to the general pool, and I think all 4 of them are pretty darn solid. And then we had 5 cards that took up space in the pack that if you have everything, you already own. So would have been cool to get new cards, but again, we know that's how that works. So a pretty even mix across the board for Colossus. Next in the Mutant Genesis campaign box was Shadowcat. So we'll take a look at her cards. She had Wolverine, and he is definitely a usable by anybody awesome ally that we're happy to have in the card pool. Magic doesn't have to be played by X-Men, but similar to Nightcrawler, her ability really only works if you are playing with an X-Men hero, so probably not going to be seeing her in other decks. We got a training card in every aspect, so those are going to be going just for X-Men characters. Gatekeeper can be used by anybody and is a card I haven't tried yet, but it really seems interesting, so I'm glad we have it in the card pool, and I definitely want to give it a shot. But yeah, you can definitely go back and use that with anybody. Team Strike is very much X-Men only oriented. Toe-to-Toe, a reprint of another card that I haven't traditionally loved, but partially just because I don't play a lot of aggression. I always forget that this card can be used to defeat minions, so taking 1 or even 2 damage from a minion to deal 5 damage back to it actually seems like a pretty good trade, and I should probably use this card more. But either way, I didn't feel like I needed more of them. Got a new energy card in every aspect, so that's going to be usable by anybody, and all of them are pretty interesting. They have some cool implications, especially this one for attacks with multiple instances of damage. That is a really fun combo piece. Colossus, similar to how some of the other ones have been handled, you don't have to be a mutant or X-Men to play him, but you probably won't play him outside of it because he gets the resource discount. And he might still be worth 4 in a lot of other decks, but you're probably just going to choose somebody else. X-Mansion, definitely only going to be using in X-Men decks. Got the Team Up card that is limited. Got a reprint of Ready to Rumble, which is a card I love, so if I kept decks built together more often, then I probably wouldn't have minded getting a few more of these, but it is a reprint. And then, of course, the resource cards. So again, we had 6 cards in Shadowcat that are only going to be played in X-Men decks. And we only got 3 new ones for the card pool, but Wolverine and Aggressive Energy are certainly very good, and we're happy to have them. Gatekeeper, I haven't used it, so I can't really speak to it. It doesn't jump out to me as an awesome card, but maybe it is. And then 5 more cards taking up space in the pack that you already owned. So it seems like they did a pretty good job of going evenly. This one was a little less of an even spread than Colossus was. Now we have Cyclops, who had quite a variety of cards because of his special ability. He had Beast, who I'm so thankful is not trait locked to the X-Men, because he's such a great ally that I've pretty much been using in every leadership deck ever since he came out. So really glad he's in the general pool. Same with Dust. I'm almost surprised she isn't trait locked because it's such a specific and cool ability. But she is usable in any deck. And same with Rockslide, just a really big, beefy, retaliate ally. So for the most part, I think a lot of the X-Men allies we'll see aren't trait locked to the X-Men or aren't required. It's usually just if they have, I think so far it's really just been Colossus, Magic, and Nightcrawler. And I'm thankful for that because it makes sense with the champions and the Web Warriors. They're definitely more insular compared to the rest of the card pool or the rest of the Marvel universe. But, you know, the X-Men just kind of transcend that. They're bigger than that. So it's nice to see that they are mostly usable in other decks besides just their own. Speaking of allies, I'm very glad to be able to use in any deck. Blindfold is probably my favorite Justice ally now. She just does so much for you, giving you that 2 thwart, a block, and the fact that she's going to give you a nice, easy encounter phase, or at least some information about it, is just always and very, very helpful. So love having Blindfold in any deck. Got our leadership training card, so of course that's X-Men limited. Coordinated attack can technically be used in any deck, and it's going to reduce the consequential damage. Obviously, this sort of is meant to be played with Cyclops, but It's not technically limited to him, so we'll put it in the middle column. Having a hard time keeping my cards straight here. Teamwork, a reprint of a card that I don't use a ton, so I wasn't that excited about it. Our leadership resource card is pretty good, especially if you're playing with a lot of readying for your allies. You have command centers, or it's really fun with Psychic Kicker with Phoenix that we'll see here soon. Angel, similar to Colossus, is probably only be played in X-Men decks because of the discount. Utopia, very much an X-Men only card. Danger Room. You know, we're seeing a lot of the really good X-Men Gray supports start to show up. They have quite a few of them, as we'll see when we sort all this out at the end. Game Time is meant to be played with the training upgrades, so we're likely only to see that in X-Men decks. And the team up card, so quite a few limited ones in this pack. The 3 energy cards are reprints. Cyclops and Phoenix didn't come with modular encounter sets, so they had more deck building cards. And Cyclops came with Pin Down, which is a card I've really enjoyed in protection decks, just reducing a minion's attack by 2, so you just kind of ignore them. Marked is one I haven't used because I don't know if it's worth spending an extra resource to get overkill, but it might be. I just haven't tried it, but that's usable by anybody. It could be really good, like if you're playing Spider-Man, you want Swinging Web Kick to have overkill. That's a way to do it. Befuddle allows you to use your thwart instead of your attack to attack a minion, so that's usable by anybody and could potentially add a lot of damage to a Justice deck. And then, of course, Honorary X-Men is going to be X-Men only. So I think the Cyclops pack added actually a decent amount of new cards to the pool. At first looked like it wasn't, but if you go back and look at the allies, we get Beast and Blindfold are especially good. And Rock Slide and Dust I haven't made much use of yet, but I think they are decent. And I really, really like Pin Down, and Befuddle seems fun. I haven't used it yet, and I haven't used Marked, but so feels like we're getting a decent amount of cards added to the pool thus far. Next up is Jean Grey the Phoenix. We get Banshee, who is usable by anybody, but he doesn't particularly excite me. Marvel Girl is also usable by anybody, and seems like she could be pretty decent in the right scenarios with maybe high scheme minions. Our Justice training card, so that of course will be in X-Men decks. Psychic Manipulation is limited to psionic characters, and there is currently only one. So I'm going to consider that pretty limited. Now, maybe 3 years from now, we've got 10 psionic heroes. I wouldn't consider that limited as much anymore, similar to how I didn't really count Ariel against the card pool. But for now, that's going in the limited pile. Mutant Peacekeepers is similar to the Team Strike, very, very X-Men oriented. Swift Retribution, yet another reprint of a card that I've just never really liked very much. I almost wouldn't mind getting so many reprints if they were cards I liked, but for the most part, they really haven't been. They're either I'm not using the right cards, which is possible. It could just be a playstyle thing. But it seems like we often get multiple copies of cards that I didn't really like that much in the first place. Passion for Justice can be used in any Justice deck to increase the thwart events. Storm definitely only going to be showing up in X-Men decks because you really want that discount. 5 is a lot. 4 is also a lot, but she does get quite a bit done, especially in the right scenarios. But only going to be for X-Men decks. Cerebro, definitely only for the mutants. Another team-up card. And similar to what I just said, we get 3 more downtimes, which I know some people like this card. I don't particularly care for it. I pretty much never include it in decks. I usually grab an endurance, but I've just never really liked downtime. I try not to recover too much, so I don't really plan for it. But again, maybe I'm just doing it wrong. The 3 doubles, of course. And now her extra cards are really, really cool. So she comes with all the psionic cards. Now they are going to end up in the limited category here, but this is pretty much what makes playing Jean Grey fun. I said in my hero rankings that I don't think too highly of her hero kit. The cards themselves are pretty fun to play. They just don't really have any kind of unifying theme. But the psionic cards are all awesome and make her worth playing. So the Psychic Kicker, Psychic Assault, and the Psychic Misdirection are all really cool cards, though pretty much only playable by Phoenix right now, so not added to the general card pool. And then a team-up card. So this one did not feel like it did much for the card pool. It gave us a couple allies that are just so-so and Passion for Justice. This one is actually a pretty rough pack for Justice, and it's weird because that seems like that happens a lot. I mentioned how Spider-Ham earlier, his pack was just rife with reprints. And it just seems like for some reason the Justice card pool is growing so much more slowly than all the other ones. And then we see here in this pack with Phoenix, it happens again where, we got some decent X-Men Justice cards. Well, not even that great. I mean, Peacekeeper's probably good in higher player count games. Psychic Manipulation is a lot of fun, and the mission training is just okay. So, yeah, I don't know what the deal is with Justice. It just feels like it rarely gets really, really cool cards, and it just grows so slowly. It also has the fewest heroes that came in Justice, so I don't know. Next up is Wolverine. We get one of my favorite new allies, Psylocke, playable in any aggression deck, so very, very happy about that. Sunfire is also a very good ally that can be used by anybody. A reprint of Battle Fury. This one's actually a pretty decent card if you're playing an aggression deck, especially in multiplayer where you're going to have a lot of targets, but I didn't really feel like I needed more, but I've already said enough about that. Warrior Skill can be used by anybody. Out of My Way can be used by anybody, but probably shouldn't be. It's just really not very good. Precision Strike, I actually like more than I thought I would. Dealing 2 damage to an enemy and defeating it and healing 2 is more useful than I thought it would be. Sometimes just healing 2 health here and there can really help you stay in hero form, save you a trip to Alter Ego if you don't want to go down there. Also comes with a reprint of Mean Swing, which is a really solid card, so nice to have if you don't own all the cards already. Get another copy of Aggressive Energy, so we've already seen this. That's going to go in the reprint pile now. So if you're buying all of the X-Men cards, you already have that. Also, I already have a copy of Colossus. We get the Weapon X support, which is just really, really cool. It's going to let you go find your identity-specific cards, but it is limited to the X-Men. And that's something we haven't seen much of in this pack, was a lot more generally useful. We get the Team-Up card, Fastball Special, one of the coolest cards in the whole game. The 3 doubles, those reprints. Command Center support for any decks. Actually really neat. If you use your allies to thwart the side schemes, you can exhaust to deal 2 damage. Justice could always use a little more damage. So I was very, very happy to see this card added to the general pool. I just got done saying how Justice just needs more cool cards and more cards in general. And I think Command Center is really decent. 2 damage a turn, whenever you can get it, is very, very helpful. You get the Longshot ally, which could be fun in the right scenarios, but you have to be an X-Man to play him. And another copy of Fastball Special. So the piles are still growing at a pretty even rate, but what we're sort of hoping to see is this middle pile growing higher than the others, and so far it is the smallest. So the fewest cards that have come so far were the ones that can be used by anybody. After Wolverine was Storm, one of my absolute favorite of the new X-Men. We get Havoc, who can be played by anybody, and he's a pretty decent ally. He could actually do a lot of damage for you, though he might take a lot of consequential. So he's kind of fun to combo with if you have ways to look at the top card of the encounter deck. Mirage can be used by anybody and could stun the villain. Gentle is really, really nice for taking out minions. Just a lot of really solid allies that can be used by anybody. That was probably the biggest thing that has been added. What we've looked at so far is just a ton of really good ally options. Now, Pixie is pretty much limited to the X-Men. You don't have to play her, but she gets an X-Men ally from your discard pile to your hand. So we're going to go ahead and put it in this pile, but she really could be in just any deck. Like, you could put her with any hero that is also running Beast, for example, or Professor X. So in fact, you know what? I'm kind of talking myself out of putting her in that pile. I think she could be usable in the general pool. There could be some fun combo builds. So I'm going to say she's not limited. Uncanny X-Men, however, definitely is. So it's such an awesome card, though. Leadership Skill is also an awesome card. I really, really like this, getting +1 thwart or +1 attack from your allies 3 times for 1 is just really good value and, you know, gives you a lot of flexibility. To me, my X-Men, one of the coolest cards in the whole wave, in my opinion, but definitely limited to X-Men only. Another copy of Effective Leadership, so we already have one of those. Forge, also similar to Pixie, isn't necessarily limited, but he's going to get an X-Men or X-Force support, and those pretty much only can be played by X-Men. So even though I let Pixie potentially go in any deck, we're going to say Forge is definitely going to be limited to X-Men decks. Another copy of the X-Jet, another copy of Utopia, another copy of the X-Mansion. Now here's a reprint I can get behind, Endurance. I put this in pretty much every deck I build unless the character already has a ton of health. Just really, really like this card, so it was nice to have more of if you needed them. The 3 doubles, and then since there was the modular encounter set, there was only 1 extra deck building card in this case, which was Hangar Bay, which is a really, really good card with the right ally and can be used in any deck. So until very recently, this is how things looked. We waited a long time for Gambit and Rogue here in the States, at least. And so any feelings that were growing about maybe the X-Men wave wasn't doing enough for the general card pool really stemmed from what we're looking at right now. And again, it's pretty evenly split. You're getting a lot of reprints, a lot of cards that can only be used by X-Men, and a decent amount that can be used by anybody. But we did finally get Gambit and Rogue. So let's take a look at their cards and see if it changed anybody's mind. We got Bishop, who I haven't had a chance to use yet. He seems interesting in that he gets an energy counter every time any enemy attacks you. And then he could potentially hit back really, really hard if you let him collect a few counters. So he's got kind of a weird tempo, but he could be maybe a good closer for you. And it can be used by anybody. Dazzler is amazing, just comes in and confuses an enemy for 4, so anytime there's a card in the general card pool that just confuses the villain. Now it costs 4, so she's kind of expensive, but you get a lot out of her. She's got 2/2 and she's 3 hit points, so absolutely awesome. Very, very glad to have her. That's a great new Justice ally. Operative Skill, I don't really understand this card. I think it's just really, really average. It feels basically the same thing as a surveillance team, unless you're using multi-thwart events, which there aren't very many of those, but it does combo well with those, I suppose. So it's just okay. Got a reprint of Stealth Strike, which is a good card, but, you know, reprint. Now this card, Breaking and Entering, is very interesting. It can only be played if the identity has a Spy or Thief trait, so I am going to put it in the limited pile, similar to how I would with cards that have to be like played by geniuses. But the nice thing about this is Black Widow finally got a new card. I feel like it's been a long time. This can work with Black Widow. I believe it can work with Spider-Woman. And of course, Gambit is a thief. We don't have too many spies, but it's nice to see support for different traits. Another Passion for Justice. Already have that. Already have Professor X. Already have X-Mansion. So at this point, you've gotten 3 X-Mansions. The team-up card with Gambit and Rogue, so that's pretty limited. A reprint of another card that I never play, Hit and Run. So again, they just pick really weird cards, in my opinion, to reprint. I don't know. Mutant Education. Mutant Education is a phenomenal new card. Now, it's only going to be used in X-Men decks, but man, does it make them go. Being able to shuffle your identity-specific cards back into your deck is just awesome. And if you have an X-Mansion in play, and heck, you own 3 of them, so go ahead and throw one in your deck, and then it replaces itself, making it just truly a perfect card to have in your deck. 3 more resource cards. The War Room is an interesting support. You know, we got one of these in every aspect, and I really like it when they do these cycles of cards. I thought this one was pretty interesting. After an ally attacks and defeats a minion who exhausted to remove a threat, threat removal and aggression is always nice, especially in solo. And your aggression allies are just really good at defeating minions anyway, so I think you could definitely get some use out of that. And X-Men Instruction, similar to Mutant Education, lets you shuffle some allies back into your deck, but only if you are a mutant, so going in the X-Men pile. So that leaves us just with Rogue, and the piles are growing at the same rate with every hero. So finally we have Iceman that can be played with anybody, and he will stun minions, very similar to Hawkeye. Karma kind of gives you the mind control from Phoenix in that you can take over minions and you don't need to be an X-Men to player. Armor you can only play if you're an X-Man, so definitely going in the left pile. Man, how awesome is she? For 2, you get a toughness ally. Fantastic. All right, for all my complaining about bad reprints, you can't complain about Unflappable. This is one of my favorite protection cards. So if you didn't already have it, it was really, really nice to get it, but it was a reprint. Judoka's Skill is a card I haven't used yet, but it looks like it has potential, reducing the enemy's attack by 2, but only if you defend, so it's somewhat limited in that way. However, it's not limited in the card pool. It can be used by anybody. Preemptive Strike, another reprint, but another great card to reprint. Not Today, a huge boon to the general protection card pool. So happy for this card. Giving you +2 defense and removing 2 threat from a scheme if you take no damage. Protection desperately needs ways to remove threat from side schemes. So that was a huge card. Already had Defensive Energy. Moira McTaggart is ridiculous for mutants that want to flip down and flip back up frequently, letting you draw an extra card, essentially giving you a 7 hand size. X-Gene is also crazy. I assumed when the X-Men were coming out that they would reprint Def Focus. You know, for all the other cards they reprinted, Def Focus just seemed like an obvious choice because all the X-Men have a lot of superpower traded cards. And instead, they basically gave them their own Def Focus so you can have 2. So X-Gene is pretty much a must-have in any X-Men deck. Got the team-up card, the 3 doubles, and the Med Lab. A very interesting new leadership card that lets you keep your allies around after they get knocked out, completing the cycle of new supports for each aspect. So now we see how everything shakes out, and the pile of cards that can go in any deck is certainly smaller, but that's to be expected. Of course, they're going to support the new team. The question is, did they support the team too much? And did they forget about everybody else? Well, let's take a little bit of a closer look at these. All right, first taking a look at the cards that can only be played if you are an X-Men or a mutant. It's just crazy how many of these gray supports and then the one upgrade they got. You know, if you think about the Avengers, they got the Quinn Carrier and Avengers Tower. And that's pretty much it. And the Champions have the Mobile Bunker, and the Web Warriors have the Web of Life and Destiny and, you know, Nowhere and so on. There are 7 cards here that are vying for space in every single one of your mutant decks. And I think there's an argument to be made that you might just want to use all of them because they give you so much card advantage, so many resources, readying. It's just nuts. And I didn't include the Danger Room in this because it's kind of got its own sub-theme. I think out of all of these, the Danger Room is probably the one you're least likely to use in every deck because you're probably not going to be running the training cards. But this is a ton of fun, especially along with Game Time. So that's an 8th gray support that you might consider including in X-Men decks. That is astounding, especially considering we're probably getting 2 more X-Men cycles from everything that we've heard. So are we just done getting these kind of cards, or are there just going to be that many more? And they're all worthwhile. Like I said, you might need to find room for 4, 5, or 6 of these because you're just going to want the card draw. You're going to want the resources. You're going to want the readying. X-Mansion's another one that I used to think was probably a little bit less integral than these others until, you know, they brought in this Mutant Education and X-Men Instruction. Now I definitely want to run an X-Mansion because you want these cards to cycle themselves. So it's totally worth it to include those now. The Honorary X-Men, I never really play the Honorary cards, so I don't care as much about that. But this can be nice. One thing I always forget about these is you can play it on yourself, even though it's kind of cheesy. And then you have the X-Men trait in Alter Ego, and then you can do some cool things there that you wouldn't normally be able to do. So it is nice for that. Throw one in your deck, throw it on your hero, and then you can use Utopia in Alter Ego, or you can still use Uncanny X-Men, things like that. And then if we look at the aspect cards that can only be used by the X-Men, you know, all the Psionic cards are really cool. So nothing but good to say about that. I think Leadership probably came out the best. The Uncanny X-Men and To Me My X-Men are just amazing cards for Leadership, especially for Cyclops. He could just get so much done with these. And the protection ones are pretty good. You know, Mutant Protectors is fun. Definitely a decent card, and Psychic Misdirection can be a lot of fun as well. Justice, again, I think gets the short end of the stick. Psychic Manipulation is really good. Mutant Peacekeepers is okay. It's probably just more of a multiplayer card, which isn't something that, I really experience. But I imagine if you just want to remove a ton of threat, that is a good way to do it. And Breaking and Entering, even though it is overcosted for how much threat it removes, it's cool that you can remove threat in Alter Ego, but it's only usable by a couple heroes. And then Aggression also got the Team Strike, which is pretty solid. Again, probably more for multiplayer where you have a lot of targets, but you could still just do a ton of damage with this. And Psychic Assault, like I said, all the Psionic cards are super, super good. This is so good. It's so nice seeing Aggression get so many options for Confuse now with this and with Psylocke in the other pile. But yeah, just so good. And then the allies that you're going to include, if you're definitely playing an X-Men, I think these are not nearly as good as the other ones we're going to see. Nightcrawler is pretty good, but it can be kind of expensive. Magic's pretty good. Colossus is okay. Angel's nice just because he's cheap. Storm's really good, but expensive. Longshot, eh. Forge is actually really good, and Armor's really good. So the X-Men specific support was definitely incredibly solid. There's only a few cards in here that I'm just so on. But what we really want to see, and the whole point of this video really, is how good are the cards that we got in this wave that can be used by anybody. Well, if we start going through these, I don't know that outside of allies, which we're going to talk about last, Aggression got too much. Gatekeeper might be decent threat removal, and it's nice to have more options. Marked, like I said earlier, I don't know if it's worth spending an extra resource to get Overkill, but it might be in the right decks. And Precision Strike is decent. And Out of My Way, I think, is just, you're always going to use Relentless Assault before this. Yeah, it can do damage to the villain too, but at a pretty not great cost. So I don't know that the Aggression cards are awesome. And then Leadership, I kind of have these grouped in certain categories. So this card by itself, Leadership, is just okay. Probably going to play this in Cyclops and maybe certain very specific ally builds. I think Protection probably came out the strongest. Powerful Punch solves a huge problem for Protection, is dealing with minions. And yeah, you have to wait for them to attack you, so the timing can be weird, but this is just such a nice card for Protection, being able to deal 4 damage for 2. Absolutely love Pin Down. You can just ignore a minion as long as they don't have, guard or some annoying ability. Otherwise, you can just leave them there and not waste damage on them, which Protection doesn't want to waste their damage. And Not Today is absolutely an amazing card for the Protection card pool. So Protection did really well there. And then Justice, this card is okay. It could do some fun things. So Justice continues just to get cards that are just okay. Now we got this cycle of 4 skill cards, which I think all of them are pretty interesting, but Leadership skill is the best in my opinion. Just so much value, 3 for 1. Now Warrior skill can do some crazy stuff too with the right multi-attack cards. So you could have a lot of fun with that. And then we also got a cycle of these 4 supports, 1 in each aspect, and I think they're all very interesting. I really like the idea of the Med Lab being able to recycle allies, keep them in play. I happen to be a big Leadership fan, and it's just always fun doing that. I've been doing it with Rapid Response for years, and now I'll be doing it with Med Lab too. And I haven't tried the War Room yet, but it definitely seems like it would be decent. I have enjoyed Command Center and Hangar Bay very much, so I think this cycle of 4 cards was very good. The cycle of resource cards we got, Aggressive Energy can do crazy things with the right events, Passion for Justice with a couple events. Defensive Energy is huge. I really think Protection probably did the best out of the X-Men wave. That is such a great card. If you're playing a lot of defense events, if you're doing a Flow Like Water kind of deck, being able to replace this card with another one is so huge for Protection. You usually deplete your hand during the villain phase, and you can't really do much on your own turn. That's just nice. And Effective Leadership is so good with ready builds. But the real star of the show, as it always should have been, is the allies. There are so many good X-Men allies that can be used in any deck. I think, these cards are all kind of whatever to some degree, but if nothing else, the X-Men gave us such a swath of awesome allies that can be used in any decks. Absolutely love Psylocke and Sunfire. Dust you can do crazy things with if you want to take the time to build her up. And Wolverine, he can just run a whole game for you. If you get him out early and play him smartly and you build him up, he will be all you need. Just absolutely awesome. And having Dazzler and Blindfold and Justice, I'm not as excited about the rest of them, but I pretty much could consider Dazzler and Blindfold in just about any Justice deck. Just absolutely stellar. So good. Weirdly, I think the leadership ones are probably the least exciting. I do really like Beast and Pixie. General can be pretty good for dealing with minions, which actually is pretty nice for leadership. Mirage can stun some of the villains, and Havoc can be fun to build around, but still probably not as excited about them as I am the aggression ones and Dazzler and Blindfold. Well, I do love Beast and Pixie though. And then, as good as the other protection cards were, I'm a little less excited about the allies. I do really like Polaris. And Iceman is pretty nice. You know, Protection's just not good at killing minions, but it's really, really good at slowing them down. Things like Pin Down just to negate their attack, or things like Victor Mancha that are going to block for you, things like that. And Iceman just kind of fits right in there. He's going to stun them for you, give you a little bit extra time to deal with them. He's okay. Karma, I just don't play a lot of 4-cost allies, but it is pretty neat being able to steal minions, so it's definitely a fun effect and probably powerful. I just haven't tried her yet. And I've never been a big fan of just the big, beefy Retaliate allies, so not as enamored with the protection allies, but I don't think they're bad. And what are you going to say? Professor X, one of the best cards in the game. So, yeah, if we got nothing else from the X-Men cycle, I think we got so many good allies. And we didn't get nothing else. We got a lot of other decent cards. We definitely didn't get as many. We could check the numbers compared to what I had earlier. So we have... So we did get 40 cards that are usable for the general pool that weren't reprints, which is less than most of the other waves, though it is more than the Sinister Motives wave. So really, if you were feeling like you weren't getting a lot of cool cards that you could use in any decks with the last cycle, it's actually gotten better this cycle, at least as far as the numbers go. And overall, my general feeling, I would have liked to have seen less of this. Not the resource cards. I don't mind getting those. I like to keep those with my hero kits. It's fine. But even within the cycle, we got reprints of cards we already had. The fact that you got 3 X-Mansions. And just a lot of the cards they chose to reprint. I feel like there could have been maybe better options than Hit and Run. And what else did we get? Yeah, like I said, 3 X-Mansions, 2 Utopias, 2 X-Jets. We got 2 of most of the, I think we got 2 of all of these resource cards. Doubles of some of the allies. Yeah, Mean Swing, Battle Fury. Oh, that's right. Swift Retribution, Bait and Switch. Like, I did not want more of these cards. So if I'm disappointed in anything in the X-Men cycle, it's just how many reprints. This feels like a lot. So, and I know that's just a consequence of how the starter decks work. They need to be playable, and it's easier to throw in older cards than, you know, they can't make 30 new cards in every pack. I get that, but I'm not disappointed at all in the new cards that came in. I think the old card pool outside of the X-Men got a lot of really good cards to play. I think Protection got 3 really, really solid cards here. And so many good allies. Justice continues to just slug along. And so, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't consider the X-Men cycle to be too much of a closed environment. I think it definitely did pretty much as well as the other cycles have done, and better than the last cycle, as far as trying to give you enough support for your team. And really, I think it did an amazing job, because they gave them so much support. There's so much support for the X-Men, and yet still you were able to get a lot of decent cards for the rest of the card pool. So in my opinion, the X-Men is not too closed of a system. They struck a pretty fine balance between supporting the heck out of the X-Men, but also letting you build older, cooler decks. But the real question now that I'm wondering, with, like I said earlier, with 2 more X-Men cycles, how much more of this should we expect? Because say hypothetically the next cycle is X-Force, which will be a different trait we've seen on Forge than X-Men, then is it going to be more like this, where there's a decent amount of support for the old card pool? Is there going to be more support for X-Men and X-Force, kind of like how they did Web Warriors and Champions? It's going to be really interesting to see. But I'd be curious to hear from you. Did you feel like during this cycle that, man, I know this is the X-Men cycle, but this is too much support for the X-Men and I want to play my old heroes too? Or were you excited about the new cards to go back and play in the old heroes? That's really where I landed. I've been using a lot of these cards, going back and having a lot of fun. And I never really felt put out by there being so much X-Men support. So that's my take on it anyway. I want to thank you for joining me. And I hope you found this interesting as we just kind of reviewed the X-Men card pool and discussed its overall effect. If you did enjoy this video, I ask if you wouldn't mind giving it a like. And if you haven't subscribed, to join along. We're having a lot of fun looking at so many different things about Marvel Champions. I've got so many different playthroughs and just a lot of content. So if you like this game, please subscribe to the channel. Also, if you really like the channel, there are now ways to support it financially through Patreon and YouTube memberships. You can find the details in the description of the video, but you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month. And in the meantime, I look forward to seeing you next time we get up in game. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.